Record the session, everybody. All right, I'll keep admitting people as they join into the waiting room, but I'll just kick off. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see some faces. Thank you for making time this evening to get together. Just checking you're in the right place. This is Electric Vehicles for Apartments webinar hosted, presented by Wattblock and supported by the City of Canada Bay Council. Next slide, thanks, Brent. I'm Jane Peacock. I work in the Sustainability and Waste team at the City of Canada Bay. And just a bit of background information for our event this evening. Back in 2019, Council adopted to announce a climate emergency, which everyone else in our sustainability team were very pleased about, because that enabled us to get moving on adopting our environmental strategy, which is an overarching document which sets out some commitments that council have in areas of connected to nature, resilient city, resource efficient community, and leading by example. And we've got a number of goals and targets within those, one of which is our net zero goal for emissions for our community by 2050 and by council operations by 2030. And I'm pleased to say that we will achieve this goal for our council operations. And the emissions reduction action plan document actually sets out a number of projects that we'll be putting in place within council and also encouraging the community to achieve that. These are available on our website, and I'm happy after the meeting to circulate links to that. I can send an email to people who are interested in that. Next slide, thanks, Brent. So council's action on electric vehicles, we've done a number of things to date. We're transitioning our fleet from a combination of hybrid and normal internal combustion engines towards more of an electric fleet. And we'll be doing that over the coming months and years as people take that up as part of their packages. We're also developing an EV strategy. So this document will outline and define the role that state government have in this space and also local government's expectations and what local government can provide in this space. It will detail how council can support our different housing stock. So we've got a number of different houses. Freestanding homes will have very different requirements to that of strata and apartments when it comes to EVs. So the strategy is going to sort of articulate how we'll manage that process, and also how council will roll out and support infrastructure across the city. And this is going to be a place-based approach. So different regions within the city will have different requirements. As recently as last week, council put some changes into our DCP document, particularly in part B 3.8, which has got some provisions for EVs. I'm not a planner, so I'm not going to go into detail about what that is, but it will come into effect when the legislation is gazetted in a month or two and will also be available on our website. We also have electric vehicle charging stations at either end of our city, so located in Rhodes Shopping Centre and also Birkenhead Point Shopping Centre. So that's a bit of background and context to where we are with EVs at the moment. And next slide, thanks. So yeah, as I said, my name is Jane Peacock. I work in sustainability team. You will all have my email because I sent the link out to this meeting. But if you have any questions after the meeting, I'll be happy to answer those for you. And as I said, if things come up through the discussion this afternoon or this evening, I can forward through links and things to an email for everybody afterwards. But I'll hand over to Brent now, and he will continue with our presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane, and great to be here for EV charging for apartments, sponsored by City of Canada Bay, and great to see Canada Bay Council implementing their EV strategy for their local government area as well. So tonight, we're going to be focusing on the challenge for EV charging in apartment buildings, and we're going to start with some material that will hopefully help you build the case for moving into EV charging in your own apartment complex. And following that, we'll look at about a dozen case studies, one from Melbourne and the rest from Sydney, and see what we can learn from some other apartment buildings and strata complexes which have already made the leap on the journey to EV charging. And
sorry, Brent, can I interrupt you again?
Sure,
I forgot, I got carried away talking about what we were doing. Didn't do any housekeeping for everybody. So if we could just keep our mics on mute, please. I've noticed that a few of you have done that. Thank you very much. Just keeps the background noise down. And also there's a chat function. If people have questions while Brent is doing the presentation, if you could please enter your questions into the chat function. And then at the end, we'll have time to go through those and I'll read those out and Brent can respond to those. So thank you. Back to you.
Excellent. So we're going to look at a number of topics. Some of them are here on the screen. Rather than going through each of them, we'll just jump straight into it. So first of all, preparing an apartment building for electric vehicle charging is part of the greater project of completing the electrification of strata buildings. And as you can see on this diagram on the screen, this is effectively what we're hoping to achieve with the electrification of strata buildings over the next decade. And you can see that EV charging is definitely part of this, but also closely related are things like the move to renewable energy and implementing solar photovoltaic and batteries. We were in a position to do a survey of over 700 strata residents in the city of Sydney on EV charging. And here are some summary results. What is really important in people's minds in strata buildings is that the early adopters that buy electric vehicles don't get to charge for free. So you have 79% of people favouring user pays charging system in strata. And keep in mind that anything that we talk about in relation to EV charging in strata, no one's going to get a free equivalent of a tank of petrol into their electric vehicle. It's always going to be measured and there'll be a cost recovery. And so this way equity is maintained between people in the apartment building that do and don't have the electric vehicles. 78% of people were in favour of installing charging systems into their building now. And I should mention that this number goes up even higher in some premium apartment buildings that might be down near the water's edge. Some apartment buildings have recorded scores as high as 92% of people being in favour of putting EV charging systems into their apartment building. But what is a bit concerning, and it's great to see council educating on the location of public charging stations, is that this is not usually well known by people. And as more public charging comes online and people become more familiar with where it is, this will also help with the drive to the adoption of electric vehicles. So here are a few key statistics from 2021. So EV sales grew by 200% year on year in Australia. EVs now comprise 2.2% of new car sales versus 0.8% in 2020. In Australia, 7 out of 10 EVs sold was a Tesla Model 3. And I guess that people are now getting familiar with seeing them on the streets as we drive around. It's a very common sight to see Tesla Model 3s. And the other thing that's happened is while we've had plug-in hybrids and hybrid electric vehicles for a number of years, the fully battery electric vehicles, or BEVs, are now outpacing the sales of the PHEVs, or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So there are over 31 EV models available in Australia, and there'll be 58 by the end of 2022. These are real-life photos of electric vehicles in apartment buildings in Sydney. You can see on the left a Mercedes EQC, and on the right a Hyundai Kona. So the important thing here is that there are other brands of vehicles now making their way into apartment buildings. The brands of vehicles that we've seen inside residential apartment buildings in Sydney include Jaguar I-Pace, BMW i3, BMW i8, Hyundai Ioniq, and Hyundai Ioniq 5, Mini, and there's probably a couple of others that I just can't, as well as all of the Tesla variants that people know, the Model S, the Model 3, the Model X. So there's now a broad support of people buying these different brands of EVs and bringing them into apartment buildings. So from the Electric Vehicle Council, these will be the EV models available in Australia by the end of 2022 by brand. What is of particular interest is the company called BYD. It stands for Build Your Dreams, and they'll have 8 models by the end of this year. They recently just launched the BYD Atto 3 at an event in Sydney. And if you haven't heard of BYD, Warren Buffett, the famous investor, invested in this company over a decade ago. I've also seen in Sydney now, out on the street, Polestar for the first time, and Audi. In Canada Bay Council area, there are Audi e-trons in apartment buildings. So which car makers are becoming electric? The brands on the top of this page are committed to becoming 100% electric. In the case of Ford, that's only in Europe, not in the United States. And by 2025, the brands at the bottom will have a strong commitment to electric vehicles in Australia, with companies like VW on the way to 70 different models of electric vehicle. Now, if you're in an apartment building, one of the things to think about is the property valuation uplift of all the individual apartments in that apartment complex if EV charging is available. And we'll just use 2 examples here. So we'll jump over to Lane Cove area, where there's a building called Infinity Cove. And this was an apartment complex that was built by a developer, and the developer promised 10 electric vehicle charge stations if people bought off the plan. And that developer was inundated with demand for apartments that had the EV charging. So they actually increased the number of charge points that were offered off the plan up to 40 in that building. And that shows that there's actually a pent-up demand for EV charging in apartment buildings here in Sydney. Another example, if we jump over to Pyrmont, at the Richmont building, this time a tenant turned up with a Model X, and they were interested in renting in the building. When the Model X owner learned it wasn't possible to charge in that building, they decided not to rent in that building and go somewhere else where they could charge their vehicle. Anyway, there's a good news story. The Richmont building, through the efforts of the Secretary Dale Cohen, have now become a pilot site for EV charging in Strata in New South Wales. And we'll come back to them a little bit later. So when we jump to public charging infrastructure in Australia, this continues to grow year by year. And while it would be still desirable to have more DC fast charging in public areas, the number of AC chargers in public spaces is growing very rapidly. And let's just have a look here at this website from PlugShare. If you're thinking about buying an electric vehicle and you're the sort of person that likes to get out into the country, hopefully this map gives you some confidence that the EV charging points are now getting distributed throughout regional New South Wales, regional Victoria, and it's becoming easier and easier to drive electric vehicles on longer distance journeys. Now, we're just going to talk a little bit about what the New South Wales government has done to assist apartment buildings with making the move to electric vehicle charging. Now, normally to make any change to the physical structure of a strata building, you need what's called a special resolution, which is at a threshold of 75% of owners based on their unit entitlements who are present at an AGM or EGM, either in person or via proxy, and entitled to vote, i.e. they're paid up on their strata levies. Well, in February 2021, the New South Wales government introduced the Sustainability Infrastructure Amendment to the New South Wales Strata Schemes Management Act. And this lowered the threshold for voting within an apartment building down to a 50% threshold level for anything that will facilitate the use of sustainable forms of transport, for example, installing electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And I'll also note that if, for example, your apartment building needs to take out any form of finance in order to do an EV charging infrastructure upgrade, the voting on taking out that finance would also fall under that new 50% voting threshold. So just to clarify, a special resolution in strata for changes to anything to common property is at a 75% threshold based on unit entitlements, and technically that there's not more than 25% against the motion. But with the sustainability infrastructure resolution, it'll pass unless there's not more than 50% based on unit entitlements against the motion. So it will proceed. And we've actually already seen some people get a little bit confused and mix up the voting on a sustainability infrastructure resolution. And the trick is, if you're in an AGM or an EGM, all you need to do is count the unit entitlements of all the no votes. And importantly, if people aren't at the meeting, that's not counted as a no vote. And if they're in the meeting and they abstain from voting on that particular resolution, that's also not counted as a no vote. So you can see that this can make it much easier to try and move these types of projects for EV charging infrastructure forward. Now, the New South Wales government has also implemented a $500 million EV strategy. This includes the removal of stamp duty and $3,000 rebates for electric vehicles under $68,750. They're putting more money into infrastructure. They're moving bus and government fleets to EVs. And what's of more interest to people that are thinking of purchasing an EV, they're delaying road user charges until 2027 or until electric vehicles account for 30% of sales. So remember, we were just at 2.2% as we crossed into the new year. And so this is what we would consider moderate government intervention. There's always room for more government intervention. For example, the Irish government contacted us recently, and they said that they're considering putting in a 50% infrastructure rebate for apartment buildings in Ireland that put in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So, you know, that's great to see that leadership coming from the Irish government, and hopefully state governments in Australia will follow that particular path. Now, there are two tipping points for EVs. The first point is where it's cheaper to run an electric vehicle, and the second tipping point is where it's actually cheaper to buy an electric vehicle. And we've already passed the first tipping point, and we're now moving towards that price parity where it'll actually be cheaper to buy an electric vehicle. To give you an idea, the BYD Atto 3 that was recently announced came onto the market around $46,000. So we're getting EVs now into the market that are at a cheaper price point. Now, here's a great infographic from Z-Car, or Zero Emissions Car. And this is based on real life data from here in New South Wales. What is the cost per 100 kilometres of an internal combustion engine car versus a battery electric vehicle? And as you can see here, you're paying $17 if you fill up your fuel at the Bowser. If you use public fast charging into a battery electric vehicle, you're paying $6.12 per 100 kilometres. If you charge in your house or in your apartment building and get energy from the grid, you'll be paying $3.06 per 100 kilometres. And if you're fortunate enough to have solar and are charging from solar, your cost per 100 kilometres gets as low as 46 cents. So there's definitely a real incentive for people in apartment buildings to want to move from a running cost perspective, and also to start lobbying their owners corporations to put solar panels on the roof of the apartment building. Some countries planning to phase out internal combustion engine vehicles. Here you can see a number of different countries and the year that they plan to phase them out. Look, the UK is probably a better target for Australia to benchmark itself against than countries with higher adoption like Norway. So when we're looking at where will we be in a couple of years, we're following probably down the path of what the UK is doing, just a few years behind them. Now, there are now an abundance of EV charge point suppliers and electrical contractors that can install these charge points in the market. And so there's a number of brands on this page, people that provide charge points, people that will install cable trays or flat cables or busways around the perimeter of the car park, people that will install load balancing equipment, people that will put EV car share into apartment buildings. I should mention that some build to rents, such as the Botanic building opposite Top Ryde Shopping Centre, have EV car shares, an EV car share for use of residents in the building, which is powered by solar power. And there are also billing companies that provide billing and cost recovery software. On this slide, it can get a bit confusing. So here are just some of the different EV charging installers and some of the EV charging billing systems that those installers might be comfortable working with or have experience installing. It's not exhaustive, but gives you a little bit of an idea. And there are, for example, case study buildings in Sydney, like the Altair building in Potts Point, which have EVBox as their standard charge point, and they'll be using EVBox billing systems for cost recovery. Or Parramatta Council might be using Explorin, or some of our case studies might be using ChargeFox or Tesla as a billing and management system. Now, there are some prerequisite projects that you can do in a strata building. You can run an EV charging survey, and the New South Wales government's even on their EV readiness site, even just put up some template questions that you can ask in a survey of your building residents regarding their intentions around buying an electric vehicle. You can do some work around understanding the maximum load that your building can handle. Some apartment buildings are installing electricity monitoring devices permanently to give them a better picture of their electricity consumption. And you can start thinking about passing EV charging bylaws even before the first EV arrives in the building. So we're now through the first section of the presentation, and we're going to now move into having a look at some case studies of apartment buildings and their journey towards EV charging. So we'll start first. I mentioned earlier, we've got a case study from Melbourne, which is the Triptych building. And this is more of a high-rise apartment building. You know, over a number of years, they decided to start educating people in the building around electric vehicles. And so if you think about it, it's a community of 157 owners. They've now got 22 apartments enabled for EV charging and 12 EV chargers installed together, because sometimes you can actually share EV chargers amongst different parking spots that are near each other. The key principles behind the way that they went about preparing for EV charging is they did some market research, and they found out that in their building, 25% of owners are likely to buy an EV in the next 2 years. They decided that they wanted to take an open architecture approach to getting a solution, and that they weren't interested in just taking whatever a vendor turned up and thrust in their path. They wanted to follow the benefit principle in terms of cost recovery, and also only people that were deriving benefit would be contributing funds towards the EV charging infrastructure. So the way they moved forward was the owners corporation would pay for things which improve property value for all owners, and then things that were specific to an individual lot were paid by those individual lots. And importantly, their sort of fundamental approach was to go legal first, which means bylaws and policy documents, commercial second, in terms of how we as an owners corporation going to manage cost recovery from electric vehicle owners, and thirdly, technical, like going into the detail of things like load balancing. Now, in this building, once you've achieved this EV charging infrastructure, all apartments in the building can be marketed as EV ready. If you're putting them on Domain or realestate.com to sell an apartment, you can write this as in an EV ready building. But the interesting thing, after getting the EV charging infrastructure in, they quickly jumped from 2 electric vehicles to 8 electric vehicles within 12 months after the EV charging infrastructure was provided. So let's jump up here to Sydney, and we'll go through some examples. Some of these are just apartment buildings putting their toe in the water to get started on the EV charging journey. And something that I didn't realize until we got into this space of assisting apartment buildings with EV charging is there are a number of high-end vehicles that are not battery electric vehicles that actually require trickle charging. And if there are people in your apartment building that are fortunate enough to own Ferraris, Porsches, Maseratis, and some Mercedes, some of those vehicles do plug into a general power outlet for some trickle charging to make sure that their normal batteries don't go flat. And so as we move to, and in some of our apartment buildings in Australia, this has just been ignored because it's a small amount of electricity. But now that we're moving to having real battery electric vehicles, in some of these buildings, they're going to tighten up and perhaps not give that trickle charging for free to those vehicles. We've also seen the same thing with some high-end motorbikes like Harley Davidsons being plugged in to common power as a trickle charge. So some of the early adopters in Sydney, Mark Maloko, a Tesla Model S enthusiast, was one of the first people to put in a Tesla Generation 1 charge point in his apartment building in Potts Point. His approach was to actually connect it onto his individual apartment meter, which it was on the main switchboard. So this is a building with not a complicated electrical infrastructure. All the meters for the apartments and the common area meter were on the same switchboard. If we jump over to Parama Wharf, which is one of the converted piers in the Pyrmont area, a similar approach was taken earlier on, where an owner was just installing a Tesla Generation 1 charge point, running conduit to their own individual apartment meter. And in a case such as that, you don't need any billing system because the electricity is just coming off the individual apartment meter. But sometimes this is not the best long-term roadmap to build for an apartment building, allowing people to connect to individual apartment meters. In St Leonard's, we saw an instance of a Tesla Model 3 owner running a cable 7 stories down the building from where their individual apartment meter was located into the basement car park to charge their vehicle. And that creates fire resealing issues in apartment buildings where the meters are on different levels of the building. And so that's another thing that is probably not recommended in terms of creating a roadmap for EV charging in your building. If we look at a high-end infrastructure project, some apartment buildings have actually investigated the possibility of getting a brand new Ausgrid supply into the building specifically for EV charging. And in a case where you've got many apartments in the building and 5 levels of basement car park, a project like that to create a new supply that would only supply electric vehicle charging into the building could run to $500,000. So, you know, this is something that most of our strata schemes in Australia really want to avoid, the high ticket items such as increasing the capacity into the building from the nearest substation. Again, a building in Darling Point in Australia, in Sydney, was faced with a cost of about $750,000 for increasing the supply from the nearest substation by 200 amps and upgrading their meter board and installing a service protection device. So these are the type of projects that through designing and thinking through your strategy and your roadmap, you can try and delay. And in most cases, you can delay those projects for decades. So we mentioned earlier, Infinity Cove. Here's a picture of the basement car park with its 40 EV charge points installed. In this building, they did connect all the EV charge points to the individual apartment meters again. They had a communications management hub and they ran data cables from all 40 charge points to the comms hub, as well as running power cables. So it was an earlier iteration where you're running 2 types of cable to every charge point inside the building. Now, if we move over to Meadowbank, we think this was the Genesis building was the first building in Sydney to offer solar-powered EV charging in a shared charging location. So this is an example of a building that has what's called an embedded network or a microgrid. They have a 30 kilowatt solar system on the top of the building powering the microgrid, and they connected a shared EV charger, so not in an individual lot space, in a shared location, off the common power meter. So during the day, when the sun's shining, it's possible for solar power to flow from the rooftop panels to the basement of the apartment building and into an electric vehicle that charges here. And this was followed by the Bircham in Alexandria that did the same thing. And now We think there's at least 7 apartment buildings in Sydney that are offering solar-powered EV charging at least some point during the day. We're not aware of any apartment buildings yet that are offering solar and batteries with the ability to charge vehicles at night time using solar power that was captured during the day. If we move over to the famous Harry Seidler building, Horizon, over at Potts Point, the approach they took at this apartment building was, in the first instance, to convert 2 of their visitor car parking spaces to EV charging locations. And look, this is not going to work for everyone, but it will work for some people that are able to go down this particular path. In this instance, they had to enforce some control over the use of these 2 locations for EV charging. So you can see in the photo, they implemented bollards and they implemented a booking system. So EV charge owners within this building will book through an online system a charging spot, and then they'll be given access to lower the bollards and go in there and charge their electric vehicles. So have a think about that approach of using an online booking system. At this point in time, there aren't billing systems for EV charging cost recovery that have also implemented the booking system, but we think that will come with time as well. If we move to the Waratah building, again over in Potts Point, they used a load management system that could do load balancing across the first 6 electric vehicles that were to be installed into their apartment building. And there are some of these systems now in Australia which will have like a live feed monitoring the electricity consumption in the building, knowing what the window that's available or capacity window that's available, and scheduling EV charging within dips. So at night time, when the building doesn't have as many services operating and the consumption in the building is lower, that's when they can schedule more of the EV charging. And that's a way of avoiding having to do those expensive projects to upgrade the supply into the building, where you need to go to the nearest substation. And now we're back at the Richmont building. So we spoke about this earlier. Remember, the Tesla Model X owner turned up, wanted to rent in this building, and found out they couldn't rent in this building. And for that reason, they decided to go somewhere else. Well, the Richmont building today, it's 118 apartments and 3 commercial lots. They've got 3 levels of car park with 108 car parking spaces, including 12 visitor car parking spots. Now, some people get afraid of, for example, using up 1 or 2 visitor car parking spots after you've gone and got approval, perhaps from Canada Bay Council, to do this and change your original development application, because they're thinking, oh, those spots will now, it means we've got less visitor spots and they're scarce in our building and they've been abused. Well, have a think. One other approach is, if you've got 12 visitor spots, just to install EV charge points in all 12 visitor spots, so that they continue to just be visitor car parking spots that are also enabled for EV charging. And that's the approach that's been taken here in the Richmont building. So they've got 10 Tesla Generation 3 charge points installed. They've got 2 ChargeFox charge points installed in the visitor car parking spaces. They've got 3 new 160 amp distribution boards, each with 70 poles on them, installed, 1 for each level of the car park. They've got new cable trays through 3 levels of basement car park. And they've got 2 management systems for one's a hardware load balancing system on the ChargeFox network, and a software load balancing system via Wi-Fi on the Tesla network. And they've also implemented an online booking system, and they've got bollards on 10 of the 12 visitor car parking spots to control access to those visitor car parking spots. Now, just for one last case study, we'll move over to the Zinc building at Alexandria. And this is one of the buildings that's installed something called a flat cable around the perimeter of the entire basement car park of the apartment building. Now, a flat cable is a single cable that runs around the perimeter, and you can actually cut that cable and install more EV charge points into it over time. And what this does help to do is avoid the spaghetti of an individual power cable running to each individual charge point in the building, and perhaps having an individual bit of conduit on the roof, or filling up a cable tray with more and more cables as more and more charge points come into the building. This is a particularly interesting building because they've also got a 25 kilowatt solar system on the roof. They're also moving ahead with a shared solar system for the individual apartments. And as another precursor project for EV charging, they've installed watt watchers, electricity monitoring devices. In this case, they've got 3 of those monitoring devices on different circuits within the building. So the Strata Committee members can see in a web user interface or on a mobile phone screen the consumption of the common area meter, and see that growing as EVs are charging in the building over time to help manage that. So let's just look at some of the learnings and experiences from other buildings. Using general power outlets is not that favorable in the long run. First of all, it's hard to to monitor, manage, and stop people being a bit sneaky around reimbursing the owners corporation for electricity that they consume. People definitely in the long term want their charging in their own private car parking space. One thing that keeps coming up is that there's not sufficient public charging infrastructure. So it's great to see Canada Bay moving forward with their EV strategy to address that in the Canada Bay area. The owners want reputable, experienced, and financially sound EV charging installers. And, this is, we've now got a plethora. There must be over 40 different electricians and solar installers that are offering charge point installation now all of a sudden. And so one of the things is looking for those companies that have a longer term track record of installing and maintaining, so that you've got a partner for your building who's going to be there over the long haul. Now, most buildings won't instantly hit the go button on a major electrical infrastructure upgrade. So even the cost of running cable trays past every space in a large basement car park is usually a little bit too large of a project for an apartment building to do straight off at the very outset. So it's about getting your capital works plan out, dusting it off, and thinking, what are we going to do in 2 years? What are we going to do in the next 4 years? What are we going to do in 10 years' time to support electric vehicle charging? And chunking it down, getting smaller, bite-sized chunks of projects that we can implement one by one. In particular, one of these is now adding Wi-Fi to the entire basement car park area, because as we know, vehicles such as Mercedes, Tesla, VW, the electric vehicles get software updates into the vehicles regularly. In the case of Tesla, you might be getting new software updates into the vehicle every 2 weeks. And if you have a Tesla vehicle and you're in an apartment building, you might not want to drive to a relative or a friend's place, park outside their residential house and use their Wi-Fi to download software updates into your vehicle if you want to keep your software update to the most recent versions of the software. So how can apartment buildings now start thinking about providing Wi-Fi coverage across the entire basement car park area. And that Wi-Fi can be used by the EVs for updating their software. It can be used by the more modern charge point systems that don't run data cables, such as the EV Box or the Tesla Generation 3 charge points, which themselves connect to Wi-Fi and can now download software updates into the EV charge point, as well as downloading software updates into the electric vehicles. So people are always concerned about support and extensibility over time. And so there are emerging standards like Open Charge Point Protocol, currently at about version 1.6J, and migrating to version 2.0 of this protocol over time, which will hopefully work the same way as the infrastructure level in the mobile phone network, where someone with an iPhone can make a phone call to someone with an Android phone, and it's a seamless experience. As we move forward into the future, we're hoping that you'll be able to have people buying EV charge points from any number of different EV charge point manufacturers, and then putting them into a network where they communicate, talk with each other using this Open Charge Point Protocol, and can slow down or speed up their charging and be completely interoperable from a billing perspective for cost recovery. So hopefully you've enjoyed this first part of the presentation, and we've got a little bit of time for questions. Just a couple of resources on our YouTube channel. We've probably got another 15 videos on EV charging in strata buildings. And we've also got an EV charging readiness for strata training course, which is free for anyone that wants to jump on and go into a bit more detail. So maybe I'll just hand back to you.
Yep.
Jane.
Yep, thank you very much. We had a couple of questions about sharing the slides from this presentation, and I'm sure that's okay to do that, Brent. We can circulate those around afterwards. Yep. So I'll just run through some of these questions. There was a general comment, I think, earlier on about the PlugShare map that you did show. Yep. Having a bit of a gap for Canada Bay area and requesting more charges, please. So that's something that our EV strategy is going to be looking at, where those are best to be located, how many, what sort of space that can happen. So that's definitely something that we're looking at. Then there was a question about are charging points all the same for different brands?
So no, they're all different for different brands, but as we saw, there are some emerging standards like this Open Charge Point Protocol, where charge points from different brands will have some commonality in being able to talk the same language with other chargers over time. Okay.
And there was a follow-up comment to that to say they're virtually all now Type 2 CCSs.
Yeah, so that's correct. What Sean said is in the early days, you had two different types of plugs. So you some of the early vehicles to come to Australia, like the early Audi e-trons, would have had Type 1 plug, but now that's all standardized in Australia to Type 2 plugs for AC charging. Yeah.
Then there was a question, I think, Brent, you and I spoke about this a little bit. What are some examples of road user charges?
So this was the, if you think about it, when people move to electric vehicles, they're not paying a fuel excise. And so at some point in the future, it could be expected that electric vehicle owners will be paying something equivalent to the fuel excise that they're not paying at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. I thought it was quite interesting, the slide that you had up comparing petrol prices with EVs, and this question relates to how that is in comparison with the recent price rises in petrol. Yeah,
so just to let you know that that slide was actually pulled down from Zero Emission Car, Z-Car, today. It was posted live, so that's how recent that slide is. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about is this information for information the same for townhouses?
Yes. So, look, townhouses can be a little bit more complicated. There are some townhouse developments in Sydney where you do have shared underground basement car parks. In some townhouse locations, everyone has like an individual garage at the bottom of their townhouse. So again, there's not a consistent message you can say for townhouses, but looking at different townhouses and the way they're set up, some of them have more complicated electrical infrastructure than others. We recently saw a townhouse complex that has a record of 16 different common area electricity meters, and they get 16 different electricity bills. And so trying to work out a solution for that style of townhouse is more difficult than, for example, a townhouse that would just have one common area electricity meter. Yeah.
Thank you. And there's another comment about townhouses heavily depending upon electrical supply to the townhouse, but the information is general. Depends on how many folk you have to convince.
Yeah. So remember, if it's a townhouse and it's a strata complex, then all the same voting applies to a townhouse that does for any other strata building. And in some cases, you might have a community title or a precinct scheme that the townhouse is part of, but basically the voting is the same in terms of all of those different styles of multi-tenant dwelling in a townhouse context. So, you do have, again, in townhouses, sometimes you've got completely separate townhouses where they're almost just like houses that share a common boundary wall, and maybe the limit of the shared infrastructure is actually just a concrete driveway. But then you've got every other type of townhouse that moves closer and closer to, the type of strata buildings that we've been talking about in most of those case studies.
Okay, thank you. I know it's not a quick process. There was a question about how long the process took for that Melbourne building that was in your example.
Yeah, so look, it's not a quick process. The Melbourne building and the Richmond building in Sydney were both 5-year efforts from dedicated members on the strata committee. So, and if you think about it, that's they're digging in for the long haul with building the awareness, getting in multiple quotes, evaluating, coming up with the commercial models, talking to strata lawyers, getting the right bylaws. And so I think the learnings from those earlier buildings will help reduce the time that it takes for consecutive buildings that are just starting, for example, tonight. But still think of it at minimum as a 2-year process in the best case example.
Okay, there's some questions about hotspotting off your phone to do the updates instead of the Wi-Fi in the car park.
Yeah, so you can do that. And because we've already got Tesla owners that are doing that, but because they don't have good 3G or 4G in their basement car park, they're driving out on the street and then setting up the hotspot to do the download. But, is this the ideal way that you would be doing updates to your electric vehicle in the long term? No, it would be better if there was a service provided from your apartment building. Now, for the people that do say, well, that's a benefit only for the EV owners. Well, some buildings are considering making that Wi-Fi in the car park area available to all owners in the building, so that as they drive in, they can switch from 3G, 4G to Wi-Fi calls and sustain talking to the people they're talking to as they leave their car and walk to the lift. So over time, we would just expect that Wi-Fi becomes prevalent through the common areas of apartment buildings.
Okay, so this question, I guess, is a bit more for me. It's about what Canada Bay Council can do to encourage existing strata managers to prepare for the future of EVs and the coming demand. So I know that there's a lot of interest out there. As I said before, we've put some amendments to the DCP and the LEP once that's gazetted. Education events like we're putting on this afternoon, information on our website. I guess looking at your neighbours and what other apartment buildings are doing around puts pressure on your own strata committee and members to go down this path and look at what opportunities there are. So it's a learning curve for council where we're trying to put as much information out there as we can. Brent, I'm not sure if you've got any other comments from what you've seen with other councils doing.
Look, all the councils are trying to support it, and it's been fantastic. The efforts they've done to try and help the community, and look, there's great resources. I think, Jane, you're going to send out the links to the New South Wales government resources as well.
Yep.
That have just gone up. So,
yeah, I just heard about that this afternoon, so I'm happy to share that link with everyone. It's an EV readiness for buildings, as Brent said, from the New South Wales government. So just having a quick look through that this afternoon, it's got some good resources in there. Happy to share that.
Yeah.
Let's see what else. Oh, there was a question about safety systems that are proposed should a fire develop.
Yeah, so look, one of the challenges is if you do have a fire in the basement car park, lithium-ion batteries can't be put out. You just have to let them burn out. But the important thing is the industry is moving to lithium iron phosphate, and Tesla's made the move in their vehicles to lithium iron phosphate, which is less flammable. And so the electric vehicles you buy in 2022 are actually generally less likely to catch on fire than the ones that were earlier. And there has been a media beat up around the flammability of electric vehicles, but what hasn't been reported is a number of internal combustion engine vehicles catch on fire as well each year. And so that's also a risk to any owners corporation.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a bit of a comment. Some vehicles also offer remote monitoring. So aside from updates, having Wi-Fi data connectivity allows a user to see the charge state of their vehicle down in the basement. Teslas, others perhaps too, can be remotely controlled to preheat or pre-cool the cabin.
Yeah, like that, there's benefits to having a connected building, and that's part of moving towards a smart building. And as people move to getting Wi-Fi in the common areas of buildings, there's a building in North Sydney area that actually has Wi-Fi for video, for a video security camera system and smart irrigation devices that connect to the local weather station. So over time, people will probably move the video security systems in apartment buildings to be Wi-Fi systems as well.
Thank you. Do any of the buildings have mixed DC fast charging systems within an AC circuit?
Yeah, the DC fast charging is usually out of reach of strata buildings in Sydney, so we haven't seen that go in. The place we have seen the DC fast chargers go in is in the resort style sprawling resorts in like the Gold Coast or the Sunshine Coast, which are typically part hotel and part timeshare and part strata holiday letting, but we haven't seen it going into strata buildings in Sydney.
Okay, and this question is around parking spaces. So could council consider relief for on-street parking permits for stratas that sacrifice visitors' parking spots for EV charging? I guess that's something that council will look at as part of the strategy that we're developing. We've got a number of players from across council, planners and different people from different teams in councils looking at that. Brent, I know there's some comments about the relationship between charging on street parking and visitor spaces.
Yeah, so I think if you've got metered parking outside your apartment building that's paid for, then you convert a visitor spot inside the building to be EV charging only, then that would be a change of use, needs to be registered with council, and then it probably still incurs an ongoing New South Wales government land tax that would have to be paid by the owners corporation. But I think over time, the New South Wales government will actually, remove that land tax that's levied on change of use of visitor car parking spots to EV charging spots only.
It's quite complex, isn't it? So this question, Mavis, I'm not sure I understand new buildings and planning requirements.
Oh, yeah. So look, one of the first councils was Wallara, that in their development control plan, all new buildings had to have 10% extra capacity on the main switchboard for the purposes of electric vehicle charging. And that's being gradually taken up by more councils across Australia over time.
Okay, thank you. And this looks like our final question. Would love to see DC charging installed by council in areas such as Majors Bay Road. This would be of benefit to local businesses as EV owners will visit cafes, etc., while their cars are charging. So yes, we're definitely looking at which locations would be suitable to have charging stations installed, whether that's feasible, what sort of space there is existing. But I know that shopping centres definitely are looking at that. Yep, so more will come in this space, I guess. That seems to be all the questions. Lots of thank yous coming in, which is really good. We've got a few more minutes if anybody else has any other questions to ask. 10% extra capacity. Could you outline the thinking of this number, please? Is this what Strata should be targeting, please?
Yeah, so a lot of thought went into it. Wallara was the first council to do that. Also, the state of Western Australia was thinking about adding in the 10% extra capacity. And that actually is really sufficient in terms of future-proofing, because as the technology gets smarter and you move to priority load balancing and these Wi-Fi networks and dynamically slowing down vehicles, the more EVs are charging simultaneously, then 10% extra capacity, you might get a 5-fold increase in the number of vehicles that compared to what you're actually thinking with just 10% extra capacity on the building. So through doing the smart scheduling of when the EV charging happens and priority load balancing, that actually is quite sufficient.
Okay, thank you. I think that looks like all the questions that we've had. Yes, thank you again. So yeah, as I said before, we will circulate some of I can send an email out with some of the links that we've spoken about this evening. And we're looking at, I guess, hosting another webinar going into a bit more detail for people who are interested. So I'll do a bit of a question and answer about that. Are the ribbon that you talked about a generic product?
So look, there's one company called Car Chargers with a K that's imported a ribbon product from Norway, but I think there'll also be like a busway and a bus duct product that was probably designed for data centers that could be used for the same purpose.
Okay, and Jean, you have your hand up. Did you mean to have your hand up?
Yeah. Could you talk briefly about the issues surrounding feeding power from your car battery back into the building?
Oh, yeah. So vehicle to grid, that the key issue there is that the charge points that allow you to do that are terribly expensive. They probably cost you $10,000 per charge point at the moment. And the amount that you make from feeding back into the grid is not enough to recoup the cost of the charge point, but that's expected to come down dramatically. And then you'll have people participating in virtual power plant programs using their electric vehicle batteries to help stabilize the grid during times of peak demand.
Good, thank you.
So just a question about when we'll be able to circulate this information. I'm back in the office on Monday next week, so I'll just pull together what we've spoken about then and get the link from Brent and email that to everybody early next week.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Fingers crossed we might achieve solar panels shortly. Great.
Thank you, Jane. Thank
You're
you,
very
Brent.
welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Jane.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Ta-da.